Okay, so again, kind of just a little bit of a recap really. A big part of the idea of this is that if there's a significant or even or particularly a serious problem with our state of mind, our neural system, it's going to affect everything else. And until we recognize that, and until we figure out what it is and treat it and fix it, then things are pretty much going to go to hell, as I think they are. It's hardly a new idea. It's been around for a very long time. And I quite like this quote. It's not an ancient quote, but I think it encompasses what our ancestors really considered an important thing to be focused on. This comes from somebody who studied ancient Hebrew texts, I think. But really just the idea that if our perceptual equipment is in any way damaged or distorted, that must be our priority. If we don't fix that, we've got no chance. And I guess, at least from my point of view, even if there's reasonable doubt, even if there's a small chance that there's a significant problem with our state of mind, our neural system, then we'd have to be seriously bonkers not to give that urgent priority. And I hope in the preceding slides, and certainly in this last section, that the case isn't just about reasonable doubt, it's overwhelming evidence that there's a really serious problem. So serious that that's why we're kind of oblivious to it. So again, this is another summary. We've kind of covered this a little bit, but I think it's worth emphasizing, particularly as we get into the next slides. I'll read this one out as best I can. All the scientific data on neurological functionality is remarkably consistent and conclusive. Our left hemisphere is hormonally retarded. Our left hemisphere cannot accurately perceive reality. Our left hemisphere is seriously deluded, and our left hemisphere continually lies without realizing. This is all in the neurological literature. It's not something I've made up. And we will touch on some of the examples. But we know this. And then you go on to all the scientific data on cerebral dominance is remarkably consistent and conclusive. Our left hemisphere is perceptually dominant. So you've got all this going on, and it's perceptually dominant. Nobody's really arguing about this. It contributes to the overriding influence in our experience of who we think we are. The singular terminology, I or me, is your left hemisphere referring to itself. So it's basically, we figured out it's dysfunctional and it's in charge. So we shouldn't really need to know any more than this to drop everything, stop what the fuck we're doing and go, hang on a minute, we need to sort this out. But of course, because this is the case, and because we're susceptible to delusion and lying to ourselves and all sorts of stuff, we don't do this, we just march on over the cliff as if nothing's happened. So is it possible to wake up to the idea that there may be a serious problem in a positive way, embrace the idea and try and deal with the condition, or do we just continue as before on the path, it appears on the path to self-destruction? And this, I suppose this is just a little visual analogy of the problem we've got, which you've probably already seen the slides backwards now. So the lenses represent the hemispheres, and basically we're trying to make, it's like being in the Matrix, like I said earlier. We're trying to figure out who and what we are using a piece of equipment that isn't giving us a clear image. It's badly distorted, but that's what we're used to. We don't really know any different. So all we see is the product of a distorted lens, and it's only ever going to work when we fix the lens. And again, just making the obvious point that if our neural system is compromised and we use our neural system for absolutely everything, then it's going to be reflected in the societies we've created, the political structures, the societal structures, our relationships with our immediate friends, family partners, and our relationships with each other globally. It's going to be reflected in that, and it's going to affect absolutely everything. There's going to be symptoms wherever you look. And once you start looking, it gets quite scary because it's difficult to find something that isn't mad about humans. Like I say, we all tend to see this in everyone else. We tend to see symptoms in other people much more easily. Of course, they're having exactly the same thoughts about us. It's this group of people, it's that group of people, it's that other culture over there that are mad. So we've kind of got to a place where the relics of our longing for a much better world are left to the poets and the artists mostly. Mainstream society is far more interested in levelling the last of the forest and building some more nuclear power stations and so on. So it's interesting that's been moved to the periphery, turning that around, and I think it's interesting to just genuinely ask the question, just to see if it could be real. It's not proof in itself, but it's an interesting exercise. As I've just been saying, if you do imagine, just imagine that our neural system is compromised, that the dominant part of our brain is compromised, it has these various traits, it's deluded, it lies to itself all of the time, it's terrified of being found out, and so on and so on. Does it make any sense? And even the response, as I say, or mentioned at the end of the slide there, if we were fully functional and sane, we shouldn't feel remotely challenged by the idea of a seriously compromised neural system. We'd look at it and go, no way, it's absolutely fully functional. But it's amazing what kind of a response this can get. And you're only going to get a hostile response if there's a problem. And the more frightened and more controlling the symptoms, the more hostile response you'll get. And we see that throughout history still going on today. Any challenge to the status quo evokes a very hostile response, particularly if it shifts any responsibility onto the people who are determined that everything's okay and they're in power and have control. So again, seeing this slide, this is the kind of thing I'd expect to see. If the species-wide insanity, our collective behavior would show it well. We do seem to spend most of our time destroying the place we live and destroying each other. And the rest of the time we're engaged in activities that don't seem to be particularly helpful or enriching. It's not that different to me to like a giant Victorian insane asylum. And I'm hardly the first person to have mentioned that. In fact, the very fact, you know, there's lots of ways of looking at this. And again, if we were functional and sane, we wouldn't feel challenged by this. But history's littered with people who were considered relatively intelligent, relatively creative, relatively insightful. And many of these people have concluded humans are clinically insane. So if you're in a room full of people as an individual, and one person thinks you're bonkers, you know, well, whatever, who cares? But if a number of your peers, people who you respect, think you're seriously bonkers, at what point do you start taking that seriously? At what point do you go, oh, there must be a problem here? Well, we have endless evidence of this. We have endless evidence throughout history, and currently very intelligent people think as a species, we're completely insane. So what should our reaction be? What should our response be? We tend to get on with our day-to-day lives as if there's no real serious problem or the problem's somewhere else. This is just really to reinforce the idea that molecular level changes can make a big difference, and obviously where there's corporate money involved, there's a lot of effort to make a lot of profits, so we end up with lots of pharmaceutical drugs that can tweak this and tweak that, usually to keep us compliant and keep us in the sort of mainstream culture, but it does reinforce the idea that small changes in molecular structure can have an impact on our neural system. Obviously, we've seen this slide before. I think one of the more extreme symptoms of mental health is self-harm, and if you step far enough back, really, when you look at our collective behavior, it's self-harm. It's not one country versus another country. We're just, as a species, we're harming ourselves. And when you get to self-harm on this kind of scale, industrial scale self-harm, it's pretty serious. You know, we're investing vast amount of resources in trying to figure out ever more clever ways to kill ourselves. Any one of these symptoms, I would say, should be enough for us to stop what we're doing. Any one. We're overwhelmed with symptoms, and yet we carry on. So again, challenging idea, but I see it as potentially quite liberating. If there is a problem with our brain, then I think collectively we're still intelligent enough to do something about it. In fact, we already had a lot of knowledge passed down to us in these ancient traditions, and I'm sure our modern technology, amongst all the madness it's created, some use could come out of that as well. I'm sure we could solve this problem if there is a problem with our neural system. It's just whether we're willing to seriously look at that and accept that it might be possible. And there is some sign of that going on. Like I say, if we were sane, another way of looking at it, again, if we were all collectively sane, then it would be difficult to find anybody who would support the idea that we're seriously compromised neurologically. Shouldn't exist. In a sane world, there'd be nobody to support this idea. The only people might be people who'd had accidents when they were younger, fallen down the stairs, damaged their head, which does happen, of course. But I've been running this idea past a broad spectrum of people for quite a while, partly to check in with my own insanity, because obviously I could be completely lost on some mad journey. But the response has been interesting. Remember, I'm saying serious neurological problems, severe perceptual symptoms. And this isn't an ego trip, or not just an ego trip anyway. It's really just a spectrum of the response I've been getting from people who have expertise in all different areas and different fields. And by definition, the people who respond are also commenting on their own neural system, because I make this very clear. It's not a percentage of people. It's not just the politicians or the bankers. This is species-wide. There is a spectrum of symptomology. Some people get hit harder, but we've all got this to some degree. So I'm quite excited the fact that there is a willingness to recognize that actually we could have a serious neurological problem, because to me that gives us some hope that we can do something about it at a causal level. Again, this is just reinforcing the idea that while I'm not claiming we are our brains or our neural system, the evidence is pretty good that tiny changes in our neural structure, tiny changes in the neural architecture, or the neurochemical regime, either or both, can have a massive impact on our state of mind, our behavior, our decisions. I've made the case that we've already gone through massive changes, and it's worth remembering this. As I say, although we're not our brains, these tiny changes have this big impact on our behavior, on our decisions, on everything else. And it's just, again, a little summary. Talked a little bit about left and right brain. There's been a lot of research, and the standard position until recently was that the left hemisphere had specialized abilities. It had traded its perception of reality for concepts. So instead of perceiving reality, it kind of made up stuff, and that's somehow good. It has speech instead of singing. You know, it's got certain traits. For example, it can't handle reality, so it edits it down. It just gives us a very limited version of reality, and that's somehow an advanced trait. It also has these other traits that in any other context would be seen as pathological, but somehow it was decided they were specialized abilities. And believe it or not, there are PhD papers written on some of these subjects trying to explain them. So for example, why the left hemisphere, or why humans are so good at self-deception. Delusion is another one. Left hemisphere is inherently deluded. Remember, delusion cropping up in the ancient traditions. Virtually all the ancient traditions talk about is sliding into a deluded state. Lo and behold, it's in the modern neurological data. I would expect it to be if it exists. Anosognosia is just a fancy name for kind of a symptom of a condition where you're ill and you don't know you're ill because of the condition itself. It's often it's often neurologically related. So if you have a mental health problem and it's so severe you just don't know you're mentally ill anymore. It's part of the left hemisphere's normal operating environment. In confabulation, again, this is just another term for sort of perpetual stringing together of self-deceit and self-lies, and we don't know we're doing it for the most part. We kind of see it in other people, but we don't see it in ourselves. These are all traits associated with the left hemisphere. As I say, in any other context, it'd be seen as extreme pathology, but they've been bundled together and somehow they're specialized and advanced according to the left hemisphere, because it's the one that's doing the assessment. So always remember that. And say if you get a chance, either later today if we've got time or online, have a look at some of the split brain footage, because it shows it in stark reality. Normally the hemispheres are locked together, and the severity of these things, although it is recognized, it's not quite so obvious. But when you take the right hemisphere out of the picture, it's fully exposed, the left hemisphere is fully exposed, and you can see how dysfunctional it is. But you can also recognize those traits that we all have anyway. They're just hidden a little bit. Again, a little bit more detail. These are some of the traits associated with the left hemisphere. And remember, all the evidence says it's in charge. I don't know if you recognize any of these traits, either in yourself or in society at large, but I seem completely overwhelmed with them these days. Of course, the challenge is, or the challenge I've found that interests me, is if this is the case, or somewhere near the case, and you get to these parts of the sort of pathology, then even if there is a severe problem, how on earth do you communicate it? How do you convince someone with dementia that they've got dementia, particularly when you've got dementia yourself? And again, there's examples, I quote a few in the book, and they're online. The degree of delusion can be so severe that people who have had strokes, who are paralyzed in one side of their body, when you ask them or ask their left hemisphere what's going on, they say, well, I don't want to move my arm today. Or they'll say they are moving it when they're not. It's a very profound level of dysfunction. And although it's highlighted in split brain research, or people with strokes and so on, there's a lot of papers that support the idea that it's endemic in everyone. It's just not quite so obvious till you start looking for it. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about Michael Gazzaniga. He is one of the earlier researchers in this area of split brain research. Him and Roger Sperry, I think probably going back to the 50s, certainly the 60s, and he's still, Gazzaniga is still around, he's still active, written loads of books, done all sorts of research. And the reason I'm using him and some other people coming up is just to highlight these are regarded as cutting-edge figures. They've pioneered a lot of this research, and I think the data is really good, really interesting data. But it's so bizarre that people have been immersed in this field for so long, they don't see the contradiction in their own data. So, I've already quoted him before. Basically, he was one of the early pioneers saying that the left hemisphere is basically deluded, it confabulates all the stuff I've already talked about, and the left hemisphere is also perceptually dominant. Now, of course, unless he's a special case, and he's never claimed to be, he must also be talking about his left hemisphere, inevitably. And yet, you don't see this, and I have got some clips if we've got time. So he's written all these books, he's talked about all this stuff, and then one of the clips I've got today, or it's online somewhere, he then goes on, in one clip he's ridiculing the left hemisphere in a patient, how dysfunctional it is, and then he goes on later to defend the left hemisphere, don't leave home without your left hemisphere. He's utterly unable to see the connection between his research and having a left hemisphere that's severely deluded. And this is across the board. I'm not picking on him for any other reason than he's very well known. There's lots of people who've studied in this field and they've failed to make the connection. Why? Because their data is accurate. They've got a left hemisphere that's dominant. It's also absolutely deluded. I thought this was interesting. Bruce Miller he's researched quite a few areas, particularly as dementia and Alzheimer's set in, and it appears, remember from my point of view, the left hemisphere is already in trouble in all of us even when we're young, and it's the side that fails first as we age, because in many ways its aging's been advanced, so it kind of comes, it reaches a demented level earlier, or dementia level earlier. And he noticed in quite a lot of patients with dementia as it progressed and their normal self was failing quite severely, it did open up the kind of classic savant skills in some people, memory, art. In fact, a lot of people, older people, talk about having recollection of their child, really good eidetic memory. They can't remember who they are anymore, what day it is, but they have perfect recollection of their youth and so on, and other things that start to emerge. He also, and it's in print somewhere, and I found this interesting, being that it's an academic, and academics tend not to use emotive language. He's talking about these abilities emerge because the bully part of the brain that normally suppresses creativity is basically failing. And remember, we're talking about the part of the brain that's in charge in all of us most of the time, including the politicians, including the bankers, including the people who decide whether we should go to war or not. They all have this piece of equipment and it's all seriously dysfunctional, so we should be quite worried. Darrell Treffert, he's considered one of the authorities on savant syndrome, the spectrum of autistic disorders where you get degrees of typical autistic dysfunction that can vary a lot, hand in hand with one or several or even a lot of phenomenal abilities. They used to try and explain this by compensation. It's like, well, we've lost something in the left hemisphere, there's a similar ability in the right hemisphere and it takes over, and it seems a reasonable explanation. It starts to fall down though when a lot of these so-called compensation abilities turn out to be 10 or 100 times better and work in a radically different way. Compensation is like for like, it's a replacement, and that would make sense, but it tends to be phenomenally better. People start accessing things that they never dreamed possible, photographic memory, perfect pitch, phenomenal artistic capacity. So it's not compensation, it's a whole other level of ability. And again, after 40 years, he came to the conclusion, again, quite emotive language, that it's rather than compensation, it's release from the tyranny of the left hemisphere. Quite a strong word. Remember, going back to Gazzaniga, the data is very good. It's in charge in all of us. We might like to kid ourselves, it's not, and there is degrees of, but unless you're singing your communication all the time, you're in your left brain. So yeah, he's talking about tyranny of the left hemisphere. I've had quite a bit of correspondence with him, and obviously I picked up on that. I liked his research, I think the data is very good, but then he goes on. So he studied this phenomena for 40 years, talks about the tyranny of the left hemisphere, and he goes on again, like Gazzaniga, defending the left brain. We're a left brain society, the left brain is served as well. Well, which is it? What's going on? Snyder, Alan Snyder, got in touch with him. He's sort of done research in all sorts of strange areas, but then he got interested in savant syndrome. And he came to the conclusion that while he felt the left hemisphere was in charge for good reasons, it's advanced all this stuff, he kind of got to thinking that, well, maybe we've traded some function for these advanced functions. Some of that ancient function might be useful. So he got to thinking, is there any way we can shut down the left hemisphere to get access to the right hemisphere? Basically, I think what the ancients were trying to do, and he decided to use some high-tech equipment that had been designed to, I think, diagnose epilepsy and so on. It's basically a magnetic field it'll go through the skull and shut down parts of the brain. His thinking was if he shut down some of the left brain, he'd get access to some of these savant abilities. Of course, he and everybody else use subjects, all of the medical and all of research use subjects that are considered normal. We have normal reference points, and yet in complete contradiction to anthropology, primatology, and our origins. None of these people that are in these experiments are built and run on the biochemistry of our ancestors. So they're not normal, really. They're the product of modern civilization. Nevertheless, despite the lack of missing chemistry, from my perspective, he and quite a lot of ridicule, well, at least pessimism from his colleagues, academic colleagues, he set these experiments up, I think, in about 1999 or 2000, and quite early on he started getting interesting results. They weren't profound results, but they definitely shifted the goalposts. People were getting better at certain things just by dampening down the left hemisphere. And some of the subjects even reported mild states of bliss, which is interesting. Because you can make a rational left brain argument, well, we trade this skill for that skill, then you have to decide what's skillful, what's dysfunction. But why on earth would we trade feeling good? Why would that have been a benefit? You know, today I wake up, I feel okay, well, what's a reference point? We clearly have the wiring to feel phenomenally good, and people occasionally do, whether it's spontaneous or whether it's from drug use or this or that, feel amazing. And yet it's enough to dampen the left hemisphere by whatever technique, and you can start feeling better. Michael Persinger, he again took a different approach. Snyder was trying to dampen the left to release the right. I think he's on the right track, but missing some of the main parameters. Persinger was thinking directly of stimulating the right hemisphere with this contraption he built. Modified American football helmet, I think, with some wiring in. I built something like that in the 90s. It's quite cool. Works quite well. Basically, the idea is you put this on, you relax, and it stimulates the right hemisphere. And he has got some good results. They're not super profound, but it's suggesting he's heading in the right direction. Again, you need some of this joined up thinking. You need Snyder inhibiting the left while you get something like this on, and you've eaten a diet that's rich in the chemistry that's gone missing and so on. No holistic thinking anymore. It's all reductionism. I touched on this with somebody before. You know, we live in a world of reductionism, and we're told it's an advanced way of thinking. We break things down into different disciplines. Another way of looking at it is it's a failure of our neural system. We can't hold the whole picture anymore. We have to look at little bits, and we don't see how they join anymore. In fact, it's a left hemisphere trait. It's considered a specialized trait. The left hemisphere cannot do context. It does detail. That's the left hemisphere explanation for its own inability to do context. Of course, it's complete rubbish. It's just useless. It just can't hold more than 2 or 3 bits of information at any one time. So that's why we end up with all these disciplines. They're all made up. They're all the names, we've invented them all. They don't really exist. And then people don't talk to each other, so we've got little bits of clues scattered all over the place, but none of it makes any sense. Anyway, I did have some correspondence with Michael, and at the very least, he immediately acknowledged the kind of massive gap in the thinking in this kind of area. No context. There's no holistic sort of approach. We're not looking at the biochemistry. We're not looking at the molecular ecology. We're not looking at the whole picture. We're looking at these tiny bits and going, oh, this is interesting. And I think it is interesting. It is relevant, but it's just one piece kind of afloat without any context. Ian McGilchrist, he spent 20 years researching left-right brain stuff. He was putting a book together when I got in touch with him. I'd heard of him from a TV program. And I'd say in the last 20 years, the classic idea of left-right split has been diluted a lot. There's been a lot of criticism. It's not that simple. They work together, all this kind of stuff. But the traditional view is they were specialized. The left hemisphere was specialized for its amazing abilities like speech and conceptual thinking, all those kind of nonsense ideas. And the right hemisphere, we don't know what it does. It's a bit weird, but it must be specialized. That's kind of where it was at. And as imaging data got better and better, it was signs that both hemispheres were reacting to stimuli that they thought one hemisphere would react to. So the kind of more recent thing has been to say, oh, well, it's not that simple. They're not that specialized. They work together. Of course, it makes a lot of difference if instead of specialized adaptation, you're really looking at one hemisphere being a dysfunctional version of the other. They both try and engage, but only one's got any real function left. It all starts to make a lot more sense. But anyway, his book, very well researched. He spent 20 years on it. He's worked in psychiatry, also a neurosurgeon, really good background. And his book, I think, has brought things up to date, and it's quite clear the two hemispheres are very different. However, despite spending all that time researching, and a bit like Trefford and a bit like others, he hadn't considered the evolutionary context, nor Trefford, nor Snyder. They hadn't looked at the, remember, blueprints, Ferraris, basic design, basic construction, basic fuel. Lots of hard work gone into this, no context, not looked at those basic questions. So, for example, he came up to the conclusion, which I tend to agree with, an increasingly mechanistic, fragmented, decontextualized world marked by unwarranted optimism mixed with paranoia and a feeling of emptiness has come about, reflecting, I believe, the unopposed action of a dysfunctional left hemisphere. So that's quite damning. And I tend to agree with it. I think it's even worse than that, but yeah, that's pretty accurate, I think. And then he goes on, concerned as I am by the apparent neglect suffered by the right hemisphere and its version of the world, I don't myself take the view that the workings of the left hemisphere are intrinsically pathological. So, this is a major statement he's made. And this is a major statement he's made. Which is it? I mean, what's going on here? And he's studied this for 20 odd years. So again, a lot of these people are considered cutting edge in the field. I'm simply pointing this out in that whenever you read something, whether it's in a popular magazine or an abstract or, an academic paper, just be wary. The data might be relevant, but be wary of the conclusions of the researchers, because they've all got this thing between their ears and they're all susceptible to making the same mistakes, no matter how brilliant they are. And again, he did acknowledge basically no idea at all about our archaic environment. And he did come to a talk that I did, and I did show this slide when he was at the talk. It's quite interesting. I have tried to contact people who I felt had several disciplines that they were juggling. It tends to suggest that they're not too reductionist in their thinking. They're able to join the dots, able to do a bit of context. So people with more than one speciality. I got in touch with Robert Sapolsky because he's got a strong interest in the brain, anthropologist, neurologist, and also studies primates in the wild. So I thought, well, great, he's going to have a better handle on this. And we did have some correspondence, and at least he immediately recognized that this whole biochemical environment that I'm talking about, this kind of whole symbiotic relationship, clearly is a major piece of the jigsaw. He hadn't considered it. Nobody in neurology has. We tend to think of neurologists as these super advanced kind of researchers, and in a lot of cases I'm sure they are, but no context. Nobody's putting the pieces together. And the reason is the left brain dominant, and the left brain can't do context. It's not bloody minded. It's not that it doesn't want to do it. It just can't do it. It doesn't do context. So we're trying to solve our problems with a piece of equipment that can't do context. Ramachandran, again, quite well known in kind of neurological, psychological circles. He wrote quite a bit on split brain research. I also liked the fact that he made the connection between the left brain correlating with the ego in the sort of ancient traditions. I think he's basically correct. I'd recommend reading some of his work if you want to sort of get a better idea of what's going on. But like all the other researchers, he made a pretty good case of how idiotic the left hemisphere is, never mentioned the fact that he had one. Jill Bolte-Taylor, you may have heard of her. She got quite a bit of press a while back, simply because, or primarily because she's an academic, works in neurology, neuroanatomist. So that kind of juxtaposition of academic, then having a sort of some kind of mystical experience. And that came about because she had a blood vessel burst in her left hemisphere. So basically had a stroke in her left hemisphere, obviously did more damage to her left hemisphere, and during that period, or for a period, it allowed her a bit more access to her right hemisphere. Of course, all the biochemistry was missing. When we access the right hemisphere, unless we've put other things in place, it can seem relatively profound, but it's still missing the chemicals it needs to work, at least fully engage. Anyway, I got in touch with her, had quite a bit of dialogue. I thought it was interesting that basically her take on things these days is, well, positive thinking, it's enough to be positive. She found it quite challenging, some of the ideas I suggested to her, bearing in mind that she almost died. You know, part of her brain exploded, she almost died, and she got a bit of a glimpse of something mystical. So that's what it took for her to get a glimpse of something, and yet her position is, it's enough to think positively. So I don't know, I just find it a strange juxtaposition. Your brain sort of half explodes, you get a brief glimpse of something. If that's not a kind of severe message as to how, you know, challenging it is to get out of your left brain, I don't know what is. Anyway, she told me I should be more positive. Okay, why is Ali G here? I have to remember myself now. Ali G, Sacha Baron Cohen. Well, if nothing else, I think he's a great student of human psychology. He's quite aware of how terrified we are, and he can walk into a room and cause absolute terror and paranoia just by saying a few words that don't fit with our social rules. It's a tenuous link, it's a very tenuous link. His cousin, so Sacha Baron Cohen, Simon Baron Cohen, based in Cambridge, is a world authority on the effects of hormones during early development, particularly in the uterus. I think his research is excellent. It builds on research going back to the 70s. There were some other people looking at this, and they were starting to make the connection that testosterone had something to do with limiting the left hemisphere's abilities. Didn't really know why, but the data was starting to sort of stack up, and he's sort of pushed this a lot further, and again the evidence is building and building and building. Testosterone, very negative effect on the left hemisphere. Of course, like all the other researchers, if he'd bothered to go along the corridor to anthropology, primatology, pharmacology, he would have realized that in our ancestral past we were flooded with chemicals that inhibited testosterone and estrogens. So what he's finding is testosterone effectively correlates with the degree at which males in particular are on the autistic spectrum, how autistic or not we are by degrees. So if he's accurate, and I think he is, then by definition our ancestors must have been much further along that spectrum, away from that autistic spectrum. We've been moving as a species to something, well, we call it autism. It's really this mammalian brain maturing and losing its fluidity and its capacity and becoming more like a typical mammal. And again, in fairness, he admitted he'd never even considered this. And again, cutting edge research, you know, he's leading the field in that area. Never occurred to him to think about the context, just looking at these things in isolation. Now the data is good, it's useful, but there's no context. Won't dwell on this slide long, it's just a reminder. It all ties together, because I looked a little bit at the gut as well. There must be clues in the gut and how a gut evolved and so on and so forth. Michael Gershon almost single-handedly turned our ideas of the gut from this kind of fairly sort of basic tube that you shove stuff in and you get some nutrition out, into this highly advanced neural system. And of course, you also build into that the gut flora that's getting a lot of attention now. Very, very complex system. So I think it's worth thinking about what you put in your gut. It's not just an empty tube, it's a highly advanced neural system. And he did acknowledge that if our gut had been immersed in the kind of chemistry that the primatologists and anthropologists would say it was, it must have had a big impact. They just don't talk to each other. You know, all these people in different disciplines, there's not the communication. Catherine Milton, I heard about her research a good few years ago. Thought it was interesting because, again, she's an anthropologist, interested in neural evolution, and also primatology. She goes into the field, studies primates in the field, and also she's done analysis, nutritional analysis of primate diets. So ticked a lot of boxes. I thought, great, she's going to have a grasp of this quite quickly. When I got in touch with her, and I was quite excited talking to her about our symbiotic relationship with the reproductive organs of plants. But like most people, her initial response was, isn't fruit mostly sugar and water? That was back in 2000, so I was a little bit disappointed initially. This is somebody who I thought would be immersed in this research, but her take was like that of many people, fruit's just something you snack on. Of course, botanically, my training is a bit more botanically orientated. I know it's a highly complex system in itself. Anyway, we got past that and looking at some of her papers. Highly recommend you reading some of these papers if you're interested in this material. And going back to the design, construction, fuel, the Ferrari, all those analogies, finally getting to some kind of clear conclusions here. Based on her work and people like her, and studying primates in the wild and their ingestion of this molecular cocktail, this build material, this design material, and the antioxidants and everything else. Compared to what we typically know, even a reasonably healthy diet by our current thinking. Remember, design, I was talking about 1 or 2%, and you wouldn't be able to build the thing, it wouldn't work. Maybe a bit more latitude with construction materials and fuel. Well, we've lost a minimum of 95% of the material that we used to design, construct, and fuel our brain with. And I'm being generous, it's more like 98%. I use 95% because people love to come along and say, oh, it's 1% wrong, therefore your whole theory is wrong. So I've just kept it on the conservative side. 95% loss of all these factors that go into designing, constructing and fueling the most complex thing we know that's central to everything we do. So again, this piece of data alone should have us worried. This one piece of data alone should be enough. But you start putting all these pieces together and they all start telling the same story. Catastrophic change, catastrophic loss, serious dysfunction. It's all a bit grim. Like I say, this is a diagnosis, but I think until we recognize how serious this is, we've got no chance of solving the problems we're creating. I mean, and I hope I'm wrong. If all this is wrong and actually everything's fine, great. You know, I've wasted my time, but at the minute, I'm still not convinced. So really just saying a big part of this problem is we're exposed to our ancient mammalian hormones from very early on. There's nothing to protect us from them. They do what they always try to do, is build a very basic mammalian brain, try to get it to mature as quickly as possible, to reproduce as quickly as possible. And that's what's slowly happening to us. We're watching before our eyes these windows closing. Our neural system hasn't got the time or the resources anymore to develop. and we're becoming less and less functional. I'm skipping a couple of these because we're nearly done. Right, this slide, I've included this slide just to remind us how sensitive our neural system is to chemical change. This is a slide representing ecstasy, MDMA. Now, I'm not going to suggest we're deficient in MDMA, that's not what went wrong, but still very interesting because there's PhD studies done on this, you can look them up. When this stuff, although it's been around for a long time, it sort of made its way into popular culture, I think mostly in the late 80s, and there was a window when it was relatively clean, wasn't so much in the hands of criminal gangs. And there were people who, well, the people they studied were people who were involved in typical male aggression, so sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, sort of religious beliefs, and also football fans. And they were doing studies and looking at what happened. And what they were observing was people who were intentionally getting together to fight, to harm each other, sometimes even kill each other, coming into contact with this stuff, and it was changing their neural system so radically that they'd be on the dance floor hugging each other, permanently changed. Now, not that they maintained the heightened state when under the effect of the chemical, but the knock-on effects changed their perception indefinitely. So this is, for all, as I say, this is not about making a case for MDMA, it is showing how powerful chemicals can be at tweaking our neural system in a direction that's at least away from hell-bent self-destruction. Might not be perfect, might bring its own problems, but it just shows you how small a change one chemical can make. Bearing in mind that we lost 95% of a massive cocktail of chemicals. So we start putting some of this stuff back and start judiciously using some of these plant medicines and using these ancient techniques. And we can start moving away from the precipice that's driven by control and fear. Right, just about out of time. This is just a very quick summary, brief botany lesson really. You may be familiar with this, but it's just to show that I'm not making all this up. This is basically a typical angiosperm or flowering plant sex organ. You can see some of the labeling. It correlates with some of the mammalian labeling. You've got ovary, ovule for the egg. So that's a typical flowering plant sex organ. It's interesting, we still use sex organs to seduce each other. Don't call them that anymore, but flowers and sweet treats are still part of a human courtship in some cultures anyway. A little bit more detail here. So you even got placenta. Seeds obviously correlate with embryos. And this is a highly evolved system. It's designed to deal with the most juvenile form of the plant. Remember, I've been talking about juvenility a lot. So we formed a relationship with this environment, had a juvenilizing effect on us, and I think that's where all the magic came from. And the hormones read the plant DNA differently in the sex organ. Instead of producing twigs and leaves and roots, some of the structure is quite impressive, very different to the rest of the plant. It's not because the genetics are different, it's because the hormone regime is very different there. Quite extraordinary stuff. So in essence, this is what happened, I think, in essence. This is a passion fruit. It should have been an African fruit, but I didn't have one to hand. But anyway, it's a typical fruit, highly evolved environment, specifically evolved to deal with procreation, early embryonic development in the angiosperms. By forming a relationship, symbiotic relationship with fruits, so we're ingesting this stuff 24/7, effectively immersing ourselves in the reproductive environment of the plants, a bit like implanting ourselves in a mammalian uterus of another species, except even more weird. This is what we were doing for millions of years. And this is where I think our neural system expanded, became more juvenile, it rapidly proliferated, which is what you get during juvenile conditions. and it evolved to run on this kind of chemistry. Our own mammalian chemistry was still there, but it was playing a secondary role. Unlike seeds, though we didn't germinate and leave that environment, we stayed in that environment through our lifetime, through generations, countless generations, and it affects every element of our growth and development. So from conception, developing our neural system, which in turn runs our hormone system, it's all being influenced. And breast milk, well, mammals produce breast milk, that's the very definition of a mammal. But of course, breast milk, the contents of breast milk are massively influenced by diet. So what you're eating becomes what is in the breast milk. So it's really quite accurate, I think. It's not just some tree-hugging hippie philosophy that we really, in the most literal sense, were the children of the forest. And when you think about what we're doing to the forest now, it's quite heartbreaking. It's the worst kind of self-destructive behavior. This is a famous quote, obviously. I tweak it slightly, and it's not really about problems that exist in the world today cannot be solved by the level of thinking that created them, more about the neurochemical regime that created them. We need to change our chemical regime, our neural structure. That's the fastest way to change our behavior and perception. And we choose to do that every day by what we eat, what we drink, what we put into our system. And culturally, currently, we're hell-bent on maintaining the same neurochemical regime that's causing us all sorts of problems. Like I said, we already know a lot about how to move it in a direction that's going to make massive, massive improvements. It's a bit harsh, perhaps, but I don't really think we've got the luxury of time to faff around. We really need to explore these things. And if, as I say, if there is a neurological problem, we need to deal with it. If there's not, all well and good, it must be something else. But at the very least, I think it's worth considering. And as I said earlier on, reasonable doubt. I'd like to think I've made a case that there's at least reasonable doubt that our neural system's functioning. In fact, I think it's quite dysfunctional. So that's a diagnosis. Might sound a bit grim, but on a more positive note, once you understand that that may be what the problem is, it's not beyond our capacity to fix it. We can treat it quite quickly. We already know a lot about how to treat it, and it's very likely we could prevent it happening at all, and we could end up with a fully functioning neural system within a relatively short time. And because it's a design change, it's not the DNA that's changed. We're not talking about thousands of years. We're talking 2 or 3 generations. We could turn that around. So that's the main presentation. I hope it's not been too overwhelming. I hope it's made some sense. We have kind of run out of time. I'm happy to take a few questions, and also there's a couple of film clips. If anybody wants to stay while I'm tidying up, I'll put them on. They're just split brain research stuff. But that's it. Thank you.